is often described as life's final frontier, a subject our society hesitates to approach, let alone embrace. But what if we told you that there is a growing movement of individuals who walk fearlessly into that space, offering comfort and guidance and healing at life's end? These are the death doulas, the quiet guardians of one of our most profound human experiences. And in today's episode, we break the silence surrounding death, grief, and transformation by exploring the sacred role of these doulas and how their work reshapes our understanding of life's final transition. Welcome back to The Fertile Dark. I'm Daniel, joined by my co-host Krista, and today we are stepping into a conversation that touches every single one of us, and that's death. Yet despite its universality, we live in a culture that avoids it. That is, as Francis Weller puts it, grief-phobic and death-denying. But there is a different way to approach this inevitable part of life, one that honors the individual and the community left behind. In this roundtable discussion today, I'm joined by a panel of death doulas and grief guides who offer their wisdom on how we can face death with reverence, compassion, and presence. And we'll be exploring how death doulas hold sacred space for those nearing the end of their life journey, helping them and their loved ones to find meaning, closure, and connection in the process. So whether you're familiar with death doulas or hearing this term for the first time, this episode will offer insight on how we can approach the end of life with grace, dignity, and community. Joining us for our roundtable, first and foremost, is a returning guest, Caitlin Gemma, a remarkable singer-songwriter and counseling psychology student. Caitlin's music is a heartfelt invitation into the raw, beautiful, and expansive depths of our shared humanity, offering a sanctuary for the soul. And her latest album, A Wider View, is a testament to the belief that music is medicine. The album's a profound exploration of grief, loss, and forgiveness created in the wake of her father's passing, and it guides listeners through an emotional landscape, encouraging them to face and integrate their own stories of pain and resilience with grace and honesty. Caitlin also works for a nonprofit, You Are Going to Die, where she helps to host open mic nights for people to come and express grief around all different manner of loss and longing. Her work really transcends performance, and it's a heartfelt call to embrace our mortality and live a life full of purpose and connection. We're grateful to be able to have her back on the show again. We're also joined by Janet McDonald, who is an emerging end-of-life doula based in rural Northern California. She's a clinical doctoral student at Meridian University with a focus in collective trauma and social healing. And her approach to end-of-life care is deeply inspired by the natural world, drawing on her undergraduate studies in horticulture. She integrates the cycle of growth, renewal, and decay as an integral part of life's rhythm, which shapes her philosophy in supporting others through their end-of-life journey. Finally, we're joined by Phoenix, who is an alchemist, change agent, and spiritual midwife who is passionate about both personal freedom and collective liberation. Her practice is approached from a multidisciplinary lens, weaving ideologies from areas such as transpersonal, depth, and cultural psychology. Early in her life, Phoenix can recall being awestruck by the mysteries of death. However, a pivotal moment of activation occurred when she acted as her grandmother's death doula after a long battle with prostate cancer. In 2019, Phoenix was called to engage more deeply with her sacred soul purpose work. She coined the term freedom doula in acknowledgement of the widespread grief that she witnessed in response to the COVID-19 global pandemic and mass civil uprisings in the U.S. due to police brutality. And these major world events highlighted a significant aspect of present day society that as a culture, we don't do well with death. She felt compelled to pursue training as an end-of-life doula as a way to serve others while also shifting and normalizing the narrative around death. And she's found end-of-life work to be one of the most transformative, profound, and fulfilling and connective experiences of her life as it draws her into deeper relationship with life. I'm truly grateful and honored to be able to share this space with such powerful, wonderful, inspiring, transformation-inducing women. And in our episode today, we'll be able to explore so many different facets around grief and loss of all kinds. And so I hope you find it to be as deep and moving and transformative as we did. Well, we're so grateful to be with all of you and explore a little roundtable discussion. This is actually the first roundtable that we've ever done here. And so it's a new experiment for all of us, and we're excited to see what comes of it. Just to start us out, maybe we could discuss a little bit about the importance of caring for others in the space of grief and dying. So I'm curious what comes up for all of you as we just step into that space.
I think about there's a lot of loss in our society and culture in the sense that we don't have a place for grief. We live in a very consumeristic, fast-paced, materialistic society. And there's very little time to honor what has been lost. And there's very little, cultural practices or rituals for us to lean on in times of transition and loss. And so as I've been navigating my own grief, I'm finding little corners of that. And the more that I find, the more I see the need. And it's beautiful to be in conversation with you all. As I know we're all seeking to address that need in our own ways.
Yeah, for me, thinking about tending to someone's grief really brings me back to engaging with people on a human level again, like similar to what you talked about, Caitlin. There's a lot of like consuming and like personas that we present in the world, whether it's online or just like in life, like how you show up as a doctor or a lawyer, or, like there's like a label that we are given. And a lot of times it's attached to our vocation. But when we tend to somebody in their grief, it feels like all of that falls away. And I can see them and be with them on a human level again. And that has been a very profound experience of just like watching those personas and labels and identity fall away and just at the core essence of being human.
Mm-hmm.
I just got the chills.
The term that's been coming up for me a lot in this space is companioning. And I really appreciate you mentioning the term tending, because that is what companions do, is that we tend to the needs of others and also to ourselves and what is present in the space. And it also means that we're walking alongside. There is no juxtaposition of power. There's no hierarchy. You are the same. There's this equanimity that is experienced, because at the core of tending and caring for another is, the human experience. Like, we all live and we all die. And I think death has a really good way of putting that into perspective. Everyone who is here will not be one day. And I think that at the heart of it, we're able to see what's really true in that moment when we're confronted with that great mystery.
Would you say that death requires you to be more present?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But it's interesting because this really pokes at my approach to end-of-life care as well. Like, there are also very logistical things that happen in death that also need tending to before you can get to the depths of grief, right? Like the way I approach end-of-life care is like in my initial conversation, I often ask them, it's kind of I have a checklist of things I go through. But one of the things I ask them is, why are you seeking support right now? Like, what is prompting this? And what kind of support do you need? And I do a lot of assessments. Like, I ask them, like, do they have a living will? Do they have their 5 wishes? Do they have their affairs in orders? Meaning, like, do they have their finances in order? Do they do they have ideas about how they want to die? And helping them organize that um, moves them towards like being open to having the deeper conversations about grief. Oftentimes, this conversation lead to them sharing about what they might be anxious about or concerned about or have kind of um, anxiety around. And so like dealing with the logistics, organizing their finances, helping them make like a physician order of life-sustaining treatments, which is often called the pulse form. Once that's in order, you can get to the deeper levels of um, of fear and and then that leads into the more meaningful deep work. Not that the other things are not important, but you kind of have to get the logistical things out of the way before you get to that. So like peeling back the layers, right? Helping them organize the outer layers. And once that's in place, it's like, okay, let's get to the meaty part of the experience, the grief.
I think that's really true. It's not, you can't dive into something like that. I find when I try to present those questions, even to my family, as we try to get our affairs in order, there's an aversion to even broach the topic. Because, you have to look at it in the face. Like you said, the logistical aspects of living a life on paper. I think there's something that's so final about it. I think and again, we are in a society that hides away and cowers from death. We do not normalize these conversations until the end. And so I appreciate you bringing that point because there is a presence that you have to have in order to be able to talk about that, about those logistical facts that need to be squared away first, because many of us are just averse to doing that our entire lives.
Yeah, I find that it really opens the doors to those difficult emotions that come up too. Like one of the assessments I do when I enter a client's home is a full assessment where I'm walking through their house, where their bedroom, that's a very simple bedroom to bathroom, right? Like in that pathway between their bed and the bathroom, are there rugs? Are there objects? Are there chairs that they might trip on? And while I'm walking through the house, I'm kind of talking out loud, like, hey, I'm just looking for things that might trip you. Do you ever think about this? Do you have fears about falling in the middle of the night? Or what if you're alone? And like, what is your plan in that situation? Have you thought about that? And like, it's a very kind of easy, gentle way to broach the topic of conversation because it kind of is a jarring experience. It's like looming in the back of their mind. And oftentimes people don't have the vocabulary to talk about it. And so starting the conversation allows them to kind of hear the words you're using or think about these topics that is kind of hiding in the shadow. And once you open up the door, it comes out in a way that is like inviting instead of like jarring. So that has been my approach to some of these topics of conversation.
Yeah, so working with grief seems to require you to see all the different layers, as you said, Janet, of what it takes to be comfortable and assisting in these multifaceted ways, including one of the hardest, possibly, I don't know, I'm curious what you'd say, but one of the hardest things, which is to field that fear of death and loss. I imagine that can be a tough part of the job. What do you think helps you work through that fear with people in their discussions of grief or loss or the possible death in the future?
Well, having my own contemplative practice and reflexive practice is a huge part of that process of being in presence with someone. And my work and role as an end of life doula so far has been with elderly folks that have lived a very full life that are dealing with like a terminal illness. And in that process, I'm on the journey with them, right? Like there's usually a primary caregiver that, in my experience, has been the spouse of the person, of the patient. And witnessing, Phoenix, you said this earlier, but witnessing the many deaths that come before the actual deaths, um, because they are on a decline. And there's a poem by Heidi Priebe that I reference a lot in my own reflection as a reminder to just like hold presence. And if it's okay, I'd like to share it with you all right now.
Yeah.
Okay, so Heidi Priebe. To love someone long term is to attend to 1,000 funerals of the people they used to be. The people they're too exhausted to be any longer. The people they don't recognize inside themselves anymore. The people they grew out of, the people they never ended up growing into. We so badly want people we love to get their spark back when it burns out, to become steadily found when they are lost. But it is not our job to hold anyone accountable to the people they used to be. It is our job to travel with them between each version and to honor what emerges along the way. Sometimes it will be an even more luminescent flame. Sometimes it will be a flicker that disappears and temporarily floods the room with perfect and necessary darkness.
I love that.
Yeah, I'm really curious what's coming up, Caitlin, Phoenix, just from listening in on that poem right there. Because Janet, that was so beautiful. And I'm grateful to have my box of tissues right next to me right now.
Yeah, what comes up for me is this question of like, what does it look like? What could it look like to have a society that accepts death? Like who would we be in that case? And what would we prioritize?
Or if you could just like speak a little bit more to that, Caitlin. It sounded like there was some real good stuff happening there. Like I'm curious what else is under the surface there.
Well, as I've been walking with my grief and now made it part of my work, I have a more forgiving heart and I'm more willing to let people go. I have more freedom. I have more presence. I have a lot more generosity in my being because I do see things, I see and know things to be temporary. And so I know the massive upgrade I've had through my experience of grief. And I'm curious what like a whole society or culture would look like if we were just more in touch with the fact that we're mortal. And maybe we would, for example, prioritize spending time with family or healing relationships or traveling or spending more time with, friends or things like that. So, yeah, just seeing my dad die gave me an incentive to look at my own life and say, I don't really want to like do this thing with my career anymore. I don't want to date this person, or I want to make a list of places that I want to travel to, because something he said at the end of his life, and he died when he was almost 73 years old. He said, I wish I had more time. So if we all realize that we don't actually have as much time as we think we do, what then? What would happen then?
Thank you, Caitlin, for sharing that tenderness and that intimacy, especially about your dad. And when I hear you recalling, his experience about wanting more time, it brings me back to this quote that I heard from another death doula, who mentioned that our life is informed by death. Like death gives our life meaning. Without the awareness of this ticking clock that we have, it's easy to be swept away by the currents of life. And I do think that that is part of my work as a doula, is to normalize this conversation about death, because it is ultimately the liberator, right? I think we have a lot less tolerance and time for things that don't suit us. And ultimately, I think life is a big practice for an ultimate death. And we have to get used to the idea, like, which is, to me, which is really what grief is it's the practicing of emptying and renewing and purifying and restoring from what is no longer, to make room, to make space for like newness to arrive in whatever form that may be. So I absolutely am of the heart and of the belief that death is the ultimate liberator and provides us with true freedom. And I hope that we are able to, I believe that we would be more free and would be, as a culture, if this kind of normalizing around this conversation, I think it would be so much more loving. I would think that we would be able to drop the pretenses of all of the things that separate us because we recognize the inevitability of time and what is at the end of that for us.
Yeah. I love that you mentioned, it would give us this new perspective on, I guess my interpretation of that was like giving us a new perspective on our differences, and to just, yeah, I think where that thought is leading me is like our society, our American society right now feels very divided. And I think that's leading to a lot of feelings of isolation culturally. And in my own experience with my family, it was like after my dad passed, I was like, oh, I need to actually invest more time into my family relationships and healing the differences and meeting in the middle. And there's been so much beauty in that practice of setting aside my ego and stepping more into where can we meet and what can I learn from you, which is a totally new approach than 20-year-old Caitlin Gemma, who was very much like, leave me alone, family. I don't want to see you, And so it's like this death is what you said, liberating. It's also, it can be very connecting. It can do a lot of healing. Yeah. Because of the reality of our finiteness.
And when you talk about like this global, and I don't know, you talked about the difference in the United States, but I'm also feeling it on like a global level, of the differentiation amongst one another.
I guess kind of like what we've been talking about reminded me of something from Francis Weller. He says, loss binds us together in a potent alchemy, confirming the heart's intimacy with all things. Losing someone or something we love brings us into the shelter of our mutual grief. Grief and love are sisters, woven together from the beginning.
Yeah. Yeah. That kind of brings it back. But that someone said, what is grief but love subsisting? And I'm like, they are sisters. They absolutely are. There's an overflow of love for something that's no longer there. So where does that overflow of love now go? Where's the container to pour that into? And I think that that's so achingly and bittersweet at the same time. But I think also, I think that's where I was going before when I was talking about this global grief. I think about the pandemic. That's really what I'm being brought to again. I think for me, that was a moment where I believe seeing this grief that hasn't been processed, like on a collective level, and then also sistered with the fear of where we're going. Like, I think there's this fear of the dark, fear of the unknown. If we don't know what is ahead of us after something has if there's been passage, where do we send our efforts to? And I think as a collective society, we don't have a shared vision. So therefore, this is like such the challenge, I think, of the moment and of the times, is where does that that overflow of love, where's the vision that we are seeing ourselves and the direction of moving forward? And I think that is what makes grief so challenging, when there's not a vision that's immediately presented afterwards.
What comes up for me is the complexity of grief. The quote that you shared, Daniel, really resonates with my personal experience of the coupling of grief and love. But it's more than just grief and love, right? Grief brings up all sorts of wide-ranging set of emotions. Sometimes there's rage. Sometimes there's longing. Sometimes there's like deep sense of isolation. There's such a wide-ranging set of emotions that come with grief and through grief. And they don't all come together or at once. And sometimes they show up in weird ways and unexpected moments, like, uh, in business meetings, or, sometimes I'm just like watering the garden and all of a sudden a bunch of tears come and I'm like, wow, what is arising right now? And and similar to your point, Phoenix, like that collective grief, right? That's a very complex form of grief also, because it's like a losing and an emergence that happens at the same time, like the falling away while new things are emerging, and like the desire to have some kind of concrete footing or answer or like clarity in the process of emergence. But that's not how it works. That's not how it always comes to unfold. So that's what comes up for me. It's just the complexity of grief.
So I have some curiosity around this idea a little bit, just because some of the words that we're already swimming in a little bit, working with a little bit, are like this idea of tending and companioning, which I thought were just such beautiful, evocative words to describe a little bit of this process of being with. I'm curious from your perspective, like what is the role that you see community playing in the healing process, like in both the preparing for and healing from, but then also with your own work that each of you do, like what space do you see yourselves holding within that communal environment?
I'll start with this new position I've accepted as a host for a grief open mic night in Los Angeles, and the project is called You're Going to Die. The nonprofit is called You're Going to Die. The open mic's been happening for 15 years in the Bay Area, and now we're starting a new chapter in LA. And something that I love about this open mic is something that the founder said at the last one. He said, I know we're in LA and there's a lot of performers here, but this isn't a place for performing. This is a place for being with what's coming up for each of us around our mortality and our grief, and is a space where we're invited to share things that maybe don't have a place in other aspects of our lives or that sort of thing. And so I feel really excited about bridging my worlds of music and therapy and leadership into this open mic space, where what I'm struck by at these events is that we realize that we're not alone. We're not isolated in our grief and our struggles as human beings and the transition points that we're going through, and that we may not have the same experience. Our experiences might look very, very different, but that we don't have to hold these heavy things alone. And that, to me, is a revolutionary idea in a society that is very independent and me. The idea that we shouldn't have to, and we don't have to, carry the weight of loss, transition, and change alone, and that it's a community effort to just be with that. So that's my current project that I'm very excited about. Just facilitating, like Phoenix mentioned the word companion. I love that word. And I love the word of facilitator, because I'm not getting up there to teach people about grief. I'm getting up there to just hold the container in which we can each process and say and feel what needs to be said and heard and felt. So
Yay! I'm happy for you, Caitlin. Congratulations on your new venture. Daniel, to your question about community, I think community is absolutely integral to this process. And you don't have to walk alone. The sentiment that you shared, that's like my tagline for my business, Caitlin. And I think it's great because, again, I think that's the whole point of community, is that community is there to share the burden, to know that you don't have to hold heaviness on your own when you're walking through transition. And so I'm loving that this is becoming like the, the ethos of our society and of this work. And as an integral part of my work, also like community is important for witnessing. I think we become more aware of ourselves, more aware of what is around us when we have community to witness us. So I think the return to ceremony and ritual in community with one another is really essential to help us to move through these things, because these rituals and ceremonies are portals to help move us through gates of stages of initiation. So I absolutely think it's integral. And like you mentioned, Caitlin, that as facilitators, like that's really the thing. We are not there to teach anyone. We are there to step back and witness the healer emerge, the person find the self-determination to find the healing within themselves. So we are only there to watch the evolution of someone develop and grow into another space and allow them the space to do that with the utmost freedom. So we're just watching them birth new versions of themselves. So that's what community means to me. I have found the most transformational aspects of my grief within community, whether it be integration groups, whether it be in circles, crying, wailing with friends, or singing joyfully and dancing graciously somewhere with friends in celebration.
Such a beautiful image, Phoenix. Just love
Yeah.
that so much.
I wholeheartedly agree with all of the sentiments shared so far. And I love the different kind of scales of community. Caitlin, you're in LA, and Phoenix, I think you are too, and like different groups that tend to grief and can hold spaces for grief. My experience with community and grief has been on a smaller scale, because I live in a very rural town in Northern California. And I also have witnessed like family units as community. And and death has a way of bringing relatives from far away back into spaces that they haven't been in a long time. Death has a way of doing that. And so witnessing on a smaller scale in a very intimate way, how like you only need one other person to witness you, and that can feel transformative. It'd be really nice to have more than one, to have your family and your larger community. But yeah, I think that what stood out to me is just like the sense of being witnessed in your experience, in your unfolding, in your transformation through grief, through dying, is a very powerful space to be in. It really dissolves the sense of isolation. It brings forth the sense of belonging, being witnessed. And I'm also thinking of another a small nonprofit that formed in my community, and it's called the Anderson Valley Village. And the village formed out of, I think it was a book club that was discussing death. And it was like the elders in my community that were getting together once a month and reading a book and discussing death. And in that process, this nonprofit formed, and they call it the Village. And I'm like, how powerful is this? These people that have like raised their family, and all of their children are grown and out of this community, are coming together, finding each other again, and forming a village, and having a focus around death and dying and grief, and how to support each other in that. And a lot of it is just like finding somebody to help move their firewood, and finding somebody to help take a load of trash to the dump. Like, that's what a village does, And sometimes those very basic needs is part of being on a support team too. So, yeah.
Yep.
Something made me really happy yesterday, which was when speaking to like the village that can be born out of death. So I was really nervous about, after my dad died, about my mom being really alone, because she lives in a rural place. She was my dad's caretaker for a really long time, and they were together for 45 years. And I was really worried that she would be super isolated. But something, over the last year, she found a community. I'm originally from like a small tourist town in outside of Reno, Nevada. And she started going and cooking food for the hotel, just like once a week, bringing like a charcuterie plate or things like that. And so they started to get to know my mom, and my mom is a wonderful human being. And then all of a sudden this summer, I go to visit her, and so is already offering to plow her driveway in the winter. And, this person is like, we love your mom. And then what made me really happy yesterday was she had the day off, and she was at home alone. And then she goes, I think I'm going to go down to the hotel and play some dice. And I'm like, yes, you are, because truly, like, yeah, this community that we really, really need, in our society, where once again, it can be so isolated. It can be so, what's the word for like the family unit, where it's just the kind of core,
The nuclear family.
Nuclear, yes. Can be so nuclear in that way. And in my own path, finding community through this nonprofit, and then that expanding outwards, like, I'm stunned by how beautiful my life is now, just integrating death into it. Yeah.
I think something that I'm struck by too is what Janet and Caitlin expressed about how practical like death can be. Like, I don't think we realize sometimes how difficult life is, and just having someone else to pick up the burdens of just everyday mundane things about life. How important and necessary that is. There are moments, especially when you're grieving, where just getting up out of bed is hard. So someone, cooking a meal for you could be the difference between, life and death, between a depression or not, and so I'm so happy to hear your mom find her village and her community, even like to find this new life that's available onto her after losing a partner of so long. And Janet, hearing the community of the village of the elders, like I'm so excited to hear about more about this community of elders who I know have a lot of wisdom to impart to their community, especially having lived full lives themselves. There's like practical information that could be transmitted to future generations because they're living it. I recently started attending like death cafes too, which is another like nonprofit that developed out of the concept around death. And it's just a place for people to sit and talk about death. And I swear, no conversation is ever the same. No group of people is ever the same, but it's all dynamic and transformative just the same. I know when I attended, there were folks who had lost dogs, who had stillbirths, who, were talking about their terminal illness, and beyond that, about the loss of their lives as immigrants. So it was just so incredible to see the way that death and loss and grief brought all of these people together in a space, in a sacred container of learning, around this topic. So it's happening.
What comes up for me, Phoenix, as you were saying that, is just that grief doesn't show up with death. It doesn't show up with just death. There's all sorts of different types of grief that comes up, that people experience. And to your point, Caitlin, earlier too, you were talking about what would our society look like if we had spaces to really discuss and talk about and acknowledge the grief that we all experience. Not just the one where someone dies, when we leave a job, or when we lose a relationship, or we move from a place, like, that can evoke so much grief. There are spaces that I've been in, that I've lived at, that like I really did a lot of healing, or, I emerged into a new version of myself in this space. And when I left that place, there was a lot of grief that came up, because there was a lot of transformative work that happened within that space. Like, physical spaces can be very meaningful and impactful part of our lives, and to lose it or to move away is really can evoke so much grief. And I think for most of us are in California, and the risk of wildfire or any kind, climate change, like the loss of natural spaces, the loss of our homes, of our things. There's just a lot of complex grief and different kinds of grief. And it would be really awesome to be able to discuss that, all the different ways we grieve.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're doing it
Yeah,
now, which feels great.
yeah, absolutely. The discussion, and also to build on that, the ritualization of it.
Mhm.
And Phoenix had talked about that, just helping us move into another stage, like to have intention. Like, I've just moved into a new place. When I was leaving my last place, I experienced what you just said, Janet, of like, I'm like, oh, I've really grown a lot in this space, and I'm now needing to close it. And whenever I've moved somewhere, I always take a moment after all my stuff is moved out and I'm in the empty apartment or the empty room, and I just sit and I meditate and I express gratitude. And that's the way that I ritualize the ending of that space, to just say, thank you for holding me in this time. And then I can let go. But it would feel so awkward to just move through something like that without having taken the time to honor and taken the time to reflect. And in our fast-paced society, it's just on to the next always. The amount of time that people get to have bereavement is extremely minimal. It says so much about what we're honoring in this life and where our priorities are. And I'm thrilled that more conversations are happening to address that, because there's a new recognition, I think, about what it is that we need societally to be healthy and to be happy.
Caitlin, I was brought to a memory about an old workplace of mine that was super toxic. And I think part of it was the realization of the lack of space that was given for bereavement. I think that was really one of the moments where I was like, this is so not the place for me. Like, we had a coworker who was in the cubicle next to mine, and he died in a motorcycle accident. And we got news of it, and like literally within a day or two, they like had moved his stuff out of the office. And like no trace, I mean, there was an acknowledgement, but it was really very swift. And then in addition to that, our job sent out like death notices every week of like former employees who were no longer there. And I'm like, this is so crazy. I don't understand how, like, again, this is a government organization. I don't know if they felt like they were doing honor by just mentioning it, but also like it triggered a lot of like death anxiety. And also like, how do you start off the day that way and you don't have any other like official containers to do it? So I recognize when I constantly had this looming thing that was over my head, like, I'm replaceable. That's what that messaging was showing me about moving through. And I feel like that's what capitalism does, really removes the humanness. It removes humanity of us and our experience, when we have to just tend to business as usual.
I wonder if maybe we could just talk for a minute about that, Phoenix. So when we think about having a space where we can talk about grief and talk about death and talk about loss, what are some strategies that you all feel like would be helpful or potent to be used to create safe spaces for open conversations and discussions around those topics?
I think that having just the language to discuss it is important. I think because it's been so taboo and kind of in the underbelly of our society, it's sometimes considered inappropriate to talk about death in public spaces or in professional spaces. There's not a lot of language. Like, people don't know how to even broach the topic. And I think setting intention and finding the right words that are like defined for the group that is coming together is important, so that everyone's kind of on the same page and start to feel more comfortable integrating these words into their daily use. Some people don't even like the word death. Like, they avoid the word, though. There's all sorts of different ways we talk about death without saying the word death. And so I think that's kind of like a baseline for me. Yeah.
I love that because I think language is a huge thing. And again, there's like, um, how do we refer to ourselves? Death doula, end of life doula? Like it depends on who I'm talking
Yeah.
to. It depends
Yeah.
on the community. That's a really big and a great point because language is how we're communicating our heart at the end of it. I want to bring it back to like Caitlin's mention of ritualizing like space for it. I know in many ceremonies I've partaken in, there are spaces for folks to go to that are public, but they are public acknowledgement of grief or right? Like it's like a like not necessarily a monument, but there's a public acknowledgement of a space to go, like a shrine, an altar, or something like that. I think having public spaces where people can demonstrate are really powerful. Whenever I do my rituals and things like that at the ocean and whatever I'm doing, they are for me, but I feel like in me standing up in my practice, it's also empowering to others to do the same in a public space. I remember attending the women's conference one year, and it was hosted by Maria Shriver after she had lost her mother. And she had Patrick Swayze's widow on the panel with her. And I found it to be the most moving and utterly humane thing to do. She used that mic and took the podium and said, "You know what? I'm going to talk about death because I'm sad." And having this like powerful moment and a declaration of what she was feeling, the freedom to emote and to be sad on public display was so moving and touching on another level. So I think this demonstration that we can be fully human in the range of emotion and express that in public um, gives people the space to touch those parts of themselves or allow those places to be exposed.
Yeah, it's like, why don't we have just mini shrines everywhere? Just in our public spaces, just little reminders of like of presence. That's just such a beautiful thought. It reminds me of do you guys ever see those like neighborhood little like free book library type of thing? Like we can make one where it's like a little death shrine,
Yeah.
just in our neighborhoods, our spaces.
Memento Mori shrines.
Yeah.
Love
I love that.
I also feel like the work as a death doula is a part of shifting the collective approach to death and dying. I feel that each death that I've attended, I can see the impact and imprint on the individual family members, the people that are in bereavement afterwards, and I feel that it shifts their ideas about how we can die or what death looks like. And I personally feel that my work is in that intimate space, like the exponential growth that happens in that space. Because yes, one person, a beloved, has died, but the people that are standing around that person, there's 5 of them or there's 13 of them. And those individuals continue onward. And whatever shift happened within them, they carry that with them into their lives and how they choose to die and how they choose to show up for another person. The potential for exponential growth that happens at that level feels accessible for me and palpable because I get to witness it. Because my work with my clients and their family and people that are grieving does not end at the point of death. It continues on. Oftentimes the relationship is formed. And yes, I recognize the importance of like having a big cultural shift, but in my immediate space, I see it happening, at bedside. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
It just speaks to the importance of working with grief to me, because grief does seem like it's so exponentially effective, whatever happens, whether it's, a lot of conflict in the family, those ripples continue on. And so each of you, what you do to help people process grief feels so beautiful to me. yeah, it brings me to tears a little bit thinking of how important your work is and how beautiful it is.
Yeah, I often feel that, there have been moments where I don't, there is nothing to do, right? Like there is just presence. It's not about offering like words that you think might comfort them or it's the right thing to say. Like there's not a lot of that. It's more of just, a lot of times it's just sitting in silence, in those like really intense spaces of grief. And I don't know that it even is like, I'm thinking of some of my personal experiences and how to share them. It's really just being there with your feet on the ground. Like here is a person that is journeying, they're in active dying. And it's not about saying that everything is going to be okay. It's not about, telling them to hold on or let go or whatever. Like there's not words. And, some of my experience has been like there is a moment where there are no words. They're not able to express verbally anymore. And so shifting with the person into that space is also recognizing that they have shifted into that space and going with them is important. And trying to interact verbally when they're no longer able to almost doesn't like match up with what is needed. Um, and the only way to really know and recognize is to be fully present, to really witness, to really observe what their state of being is. So yeah, it's a really sacred space to be in.
It's very pure.
Yeah.
Transformative, and I often say that death is psychedelic because you're not in this dimension, in this realm at all any longer when someone is actively dying. Caitlin and I are part of a threshold choir, and a threshold choir is a group who sings bedside at those who are transitioning. And in that practice, because we practice regularly as if someone was bedside and what it would be like, Janet, that is such a brilliant point that so much of it is about presence. There's lots of gaps in time that happen when people are actively dying and it's like they're laboring into a new state of being. And the song, the music, we recognize that they're not going to necessarily have words because when you're actively dying, your body is shutting down. But there's a lot of just presencing and allowing yourself to go there with them as their functions start to cease. There's a lot of attentiveness in holding them in their witnessing, moving from one stage to another. I just definitely want to echo that. Like time, it's a very liminal state. It seems suspended. Like the breath goes out of the room and you don't know, you're just somewhere else when you're with someone when they're leaving.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit to this idea of presence in the ways that you maybe prepare for and maintain that presence as you go to sit with somebody. Because I think it's really normal and natural for people when they come into a room to struggle to be fully present and to feel the need to say something. And so I just wonder, how do you prepare yourself to be present in that way that you're talking about? And then once you're actually in the space, how do you maintain that presence without kind of getting knocked out of the pocket?
There's this death doula named Alua Arthur, and I love what she said. She said in her practice, she mentioned, like Janet, the feet on the ground. So grounding is really like recognizing and being aware of your body and being solid. So the anchoring. For me, I have a go bag, like a medicine bag of things that also I have for elements for my own safety, but it depends every time. Depending on the need of the person and the environment that you're in. But for me, a lot of the preparation is mental and is spiritual. I feel that a lot of this death doula work is the burden is carried by spirit. I am not doing it on my own. I am finding collaborative relationship where the divine is working through me because sometimes it can get too heavy. So having prayers practice to, again, be a clear channel vessel for source to work through me, I think is what helps to sustain me, because it's easy to get overwhelmed by human emotion in those types of moments. So the acknowledgement and the willingness to put myself aside and recognize that spirit is here and is a presence that's working within me and through me is a way that I help to anchor and be present in those moments.
Yeah, my approach is to really cultivate a sense of meaning in my care for my patients, and really, like, everything when I'm at the edge where I really don't when I'm in a situation where I feel like I don't know how to approach or care for them or feel like anxious, I really kind of lean into how can I do this where they feel that they're not losing their sense of dignity and humanity? Because as the body starts to shut down, there's a lot of assistance that an individual might need in it, like they might need help bathing, they might need help going to the bathroom, they might need help cutting their fingernails. And with every step of care that I give, it's like, am I doing this in a way that is respectful, where the patient feel that they're not losing their sense of dignity and humanity? And that really helps me stay in presence with them up to the very end, like end of life care is such a wide spectrum. Sometimes it's just showing up and doing dishes or putting a load of laundry in the wash. Other times it's sitting at bedside and just holding them. Sometimes it's giving a haircut or cutting their fingernails and toenails. Sometimes it's bathing and doing things. It's just such a wide range. It's a really intimate space to be in with someone. And so constantly checking in and reminding myself, like, I'm in a space of service and this is a human being, even though they're no longer able to move themselves from one to another, even though they are no longer verbal, even though they are no longer, those are not things that define you as a human being, right? Like just your ability to, like, just your consciousness in your being is enough, and even beyond that space, like even after death, if you do a home, if you sit vigil and you're doing like a home, like funeral service or ceremony after death, like how do you wash the body? How do you speak? I often continue to speak to my patients. And the way you are being witnessed in that space by family members allows them to step in and match that. I see that they match that space you're setting. You're kind of setting the tone for that. And it helps, a family member step in the same way. Yeah.
Yeah, it like provides an opening. It's not that hard stop that I think people often look at death, The person, the relationship still feels very alive, and it keeps that connection open. Thank you for evoking that.
Caitlin, I'm curious about your experience because it is somewhat different with these open mics that you do. I'm curious how you prepare for and stay present in these situations where rather than maybe being at a bedside, you're hosting more of an event.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I haven't yet hosted. I've participated as a featured musician, and so that sort of feels like a co-host situation. So I've been giving it a lot of thought. I'm happy that I have about a month and a half away from the next event to think about it, because there is a lot of responsibility that comes with that holding of that space. And I'm sort of preparing for it in the sense that I'm reading a lot of Mary Oliver poetry right now, and I love her because she talks a lot about death and beauty and nature. And I love her perspective. Her words are very inviting into the present moment. I feel like I'm witnessing the trees alongside her when I read her poetry. And so I guess my preparation is more to do with like being comfortable with sitting with discomfort and practicing, even just holding silence. Sometimes silence is what's needed. And I host a grief. It's not an open mic, but it's a group, an online group. And it's less like reading poetry and less performances and music. And it's more of just like an open sharing meeting. And when I do that, I take note of when I want to get into a space of teaching or fixing or that sort of. So I'm mindful of that because a lot of this work is more to do with sitting back and being witnessed, as to what Phoenix said earlier, holding a space, holding a container for others to develop into their next stage and their next process, and holding that space for that transition or perspective or shift, or just a simple witness. Like sometimes things that are shared in the group is just like, I'm struggling and I don't know what to do. And as I've hosted those sorts of groups, I've learned that it's like, oh, that just needs to be heard. It's as simple as that. It's beautiful how simple it can be. It surprises me. So yeah, I think my preparation is just noticing through any conversation I have from now until the next open mic, where if I have a friend talking about a breakup or someone talking about some other kind of loss, that I notice the part of me that wants to be like, oh, blah, 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 it's not that, you'll be okay, or, trying to go into fix, that I notice that that's there, and I think that will always be there, right? But to engage in a different way. And a lot of times that's just saying nothing and just being. Yeah. It's amazing how powerful that is.
Well, to all our listeners, thank you for joining us for part 1 of this roundtable discussion on the fertile dark. I am so grateful that we get to explore more time with Janet, Caitlin, and Phoenix. And I hope that you join us next week for part 2. And I invite you to tell us how this episode is affecting you so far, to ask any questions that you might have. It seems like our guests are excited to speak more about this topic. So give us a shout out through email or social media. And until next time, keep delving deep and embracing the journey.